All right, guys, this was my experience fixing what I think will probably be an issue that a lot of you will run into if you're messing with these cars. If you're as foolish enough to keep one of these cars as I am. Um, for context, this is an M103 engine. This is a 1991 300E. I have dealt with multiple issues related to the K-Jet. Both of my major issues have been related to this thing straight up leaking gas. My first one was the EHA valve leaking. There's an O-ring inside there that apparently fails. It's very common with smelling gas in the engine bay. Tried to replace this myself with a brand new Bosch OEM part. Tried to calibrate it myself. Messed with this thing a little too much without having a pressure tester and got myself into just a huge headache. Ended up replacing this entire unit, and it was running great ever since then. But then I ended up having an issue from the back of the car, which was another fuel leak coming from a fitting that fits down here. This is what my new fitting looks like. There's a lot of extra hose there to try to make my new fitting fit because it was a custom part. But this is the part that failed. And as you can see, it's a three-way fitting with one of these parts, I believe it's this end, coming from the fuel tank. This is going to the fuel accumulator, and this was going to the fuel pump. This is the piece right here that failed. There was like a pinhole in it, and I walked out of my house, smelled gas, and you can kind of see that crack right there. That's where it actually failed from. Fun part of owning these cars, they don't make this part anymore. As you can see, these fittings are kind of like permanently attached, so there's really no way to just like cut this hose and replace it. I mean, I could have tried to cut it right here, but it just would not, have been a long-term fix. So I had to make my own one of these. So I just basically went to a hydraulic shop. I went to PureTech. They were able to piece something together for me that essentially did this exact same thing. It was quite a bit larger and a little bit heavier. It was rated for much higher pressures than what this is rated for. But upon replacing that, I cut hoses, tried to get it to fit as best as I could. It ran fine after initially installing it, but once the car sat for a few days, I tried to start it. It was just like cranking, sounded like it wanted to start. It would turn over and catch, but I could tell that there was a fuel delivery issue. I couldn't figure out what the problem was, considering that it had started fine when I initially installed the part, but then wouldn't afterwards. And what ended up happening was, because my other fitting was larger than this one, it was putting pressure on the hose coming from the fuel tank, not allowing the fuel to flow through as easily. There was fuel flowing through, and I verified that by removing the part and putting it back on. But it just was not enough. It was kinked just slightly, ever so slightly enough, which, if you're familiar with these engines, any little thing, it's very temperamental. It might not run well. So I ended up having to put the large loop, which you see right there, to kind of relieve tension, and basically just make it so I didn't have to force that fitting in there or cut too much more hose to try to get it to fit. But I cannot recommend enough getting one of these, because this pressure tester allowed me to know that I didn't have an issue with my check valves, with my fuel accumulator, with the fuel distributor itself. It's like a wild goose chase to try to figure out what's going on with these engines, because most of the problems seem to be related to this fuel system, to the KE Jetronic. And this is what allowed me to figure out what was going on with it and stuff. So just in case anybody else finds themselves in this situation, I wanted to document how exactly I solved it, because it was just not a super straightforward issue. As most of the problems with this car cannot be straightforward. So I will put a link to this one that I bought. I ordered this from Germany, from a company, I believe it was called missingparts.de. Worked fabulously. Not the easiest to hook up. I think the one from Mercedes source, it looks like he uses fittings at the end here that are a little bit easier to get to, because as you can see, there's this fuel line right here, and right here that make it a little difficult to screw this in because there's not a lot of clearance once you initially try to put this screw in. This one was much easier, but it still wasn't the easiest, but I really can't complain. I paid about 80 something dollars for this. I had to pay extra because of the tariffs right now, so it was not as cheap as it could have been, but it was a lot cheaper than going to a shop. And I'm in Southern California. If you're in a situation like me, there really are no shops that are willing to look at these, or if you can find one, there's a long line ahead of you of people who are trying to get their cars looked at. So yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any problems. I did a lot of reading and stuff like that, but this was my situation, and I hope that it helps somebody. If you ever find yourself with this part failing, get it custom made at a hydraulic shop. You could probably even piece it together yourself, and just make sure that the hoses are not constricted even slightly, because it could make a big problem when it comes to starting up afterwards. So yeah, thanks everybody.